Puneet Ranjan, thank you so much for being with us. A very warm welcome to this session. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Non-financial disclosures, it's a huge part of all of our work towards climate change. Since we have you here, I wanted to start with that very broad question. Being an outsider to this, when you look at emission standards, you see the CDP, the IIRC, you have the TCFD framework, thanks to Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor. Could you talk me through basically where we've got to in standardizing these measures, how important that is, is there still room for companies to cherry pick the measures at the moment?
It's great to be with you. That's a very good question. First, as we've navigated through this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, there have been some silver linings. And one of the silver linings is that climate change has come to the fore. It is an issue that we all need to address. It is a global issue that we must address. That's the challenge of this generation. Now, to your question, there needs to be convergence in standards so that we can measure and in a very comparable way what companies and entities are doing. And to that, what Deloitte and the other big four, working with the World Economic Forum, IBC, have done over the last 12 to 14 months is we've come up with voluntary standards using and building off some of the great work that has already been done, some of the entities that you just mentioned. And we've come up with four what we believe are enduring pillars: people, planet, prosperity, and the principles of governance. And underneath those 21 standards, again, building off some of the standards that exist. And we've got over 100 companies that have signed up voluntarily to disclose on them, including Deloitte, and we just disclosed just a few weeks ago. That is a first step. But what needs to happen is further convergence, and we are positive about the work that the IFRS Foundation is doing, for instance. In fact, Deloitte, working with the World Economic Forum, is working with the IFRS Foundation to converge and come up with a set of standards that are applicable consistently across the globe so that people can compare and hold companies to account.
And a very simple question of, why is standardization and reporting so difficult? Is it that some companies are reluctant to do the reporting, quite frankly? Is it that, maybe a lot of investors don't care? Is it that some of these things are difficult to put a number to? Why is reporting been so difficult? And why have we ended up with this sort of piecemeal landscape of measures?
First, the issue that we're trying to tackle is a complex issue, and therefore what has organically developed with a number of entities is a point of view to address a portion of the issue, and that is why a standard set that applies across companies, across geographies is so important, and that is what we are working on. And the example that I just gave you, again, it's voluntary, but the areas that we've identified with the World Economic Forum, I believe, provide a starting building block to develop standards. Now, to your question in terms of why, what is the import for doing this? Increasingly, key stakeholders are embracing the idea that climate and ESG measures are incredibly important. Let me give you an example. Deloitte has 345,000 professionals that comprise Deloitte. 86% of them are millennials and Gen Zs. When we polled them 6 months ago, their number one issue was climate. We recruit 50,000 professionals every year. I go speak on university campuses in America, in Europe, in India. Invariably, I'm asked, what does Deloitte do beyond its core profit motive? I'm giving you that example because here is a stakeholder that I covet. My professionals, individuals that I want to attract to Deloitte, for them, climate and ESG measures like diversity and inclusion are some of the top priority areas. The same, I can give a similar example for customers and increasingly investors. But we need to get to a common regime of standards that are accepted and are comparable across sectors and across geographies. And that is what we are working on.
So I think you've touched on this here, but I was thinking a bit about your things called stakeholder capitalism metrics that you guys put out with the other big four accounting firms. And, I think it was 2/3 of companies when you first put out the report that said that they really wanted to, at least with the core principles, the core metrics, get involved. What do we do with the companies that don't get involved? I mean, how do we hold them accountable? You sort of touch on the impact on sort of employment and how attractive they are to work for. But, as civil society organizations, as investors, what do we do with non-compliance?
Increasingly, first off, regulators are going to step up, are stepping up in terms of demanding or demanding disclosure in a consistent way. And so that is certainly going to drive to a level of consistency. But I think as I've said to you, in nearly every sector, every client that I speak with, it is becoming apparent that stakeholders from customers to employees and investors are increasingly concerned about and asking about disclosure in ESG areas like climate. And so I think the confluence of the two, regulators, civil society, as well as key stakeholders like customers, employees, and investors, will get us to a point where we will have common disclosure and common standards.
I mean, the stakeholder we most often think of here, of course, are investors. This idea of the double materiality, that actually it matters for your bottom line, what you do with where you source your water, the risk of sort of child labor or forced labor at your company. Is there already evidence that this has a real tangible impact on profitability for the world's biggest companies? Everyone wants to ask about it. It's nice to ask about it, but does it really matter if you're trying to make money here?
Absolutely. And I can give Deloitte as an example. I mean, we are a purpose-driven organization. Our purpose is to serve our clients with distinction, to uphold the public interest, to hire the very best individuals, and through mentorship and apprenticeship, create future leaders, and to give back to the communities that we live and work in. We, over the last 5 years, have had wonderful bottom line performance. At the same time, we have given back $1.1 billion over the last 5 years back into the communities that we live and work in, $233 million last year. And we have published just a few weeks ago across the spectrum from climate, greenhouse, to what we are doing in terms of the impact that we are creating for our communities. And so it is important, and I can actually argue very clearly that the fact that we look at this from an entire stakeholder standpoint has resulted in better bottom line performance than we've ever had in the last 40, 50 years. And so it is not just the right thing to do, it is the right business thing to do. I mean, I gave you the example of the 86% of the 345,000 individuals that call Deloitte home. If for them, the top issue is climate and other ESG metrics, and if we're not addressing that, my ability to retain those individuals and therefore result in a positive bottom line is seriously impaired. My ability to hire, we're only as good as a firm, as an organization, by the quality of people that we hire. my ability to hire individuals when I'm asked at university campuses across the globe, what does Deloitte do beyond its core profit motive? It is really important that companies look at the entire spectrum and the impact that these doing the right thing, because it results in the right business outcome. And the example that I gave you of Deloitte is a very good example, and there are many other companies that are embracing that view.
And Deloitte is an interesting example because, of course, if you're a consulting company, as you know, if you're a tech company, um, I'm guessing that how easy it is for you to report these things is different to if you're an oil and gas company, a chemicals company. When we talk of standardization, how much is that differentiation between industries very problematic, very difficult, both in the motivation to report, but also in, frankly, the ability to tot up your water bill, your carbon emissions, and so on?
Well, listen, you asked this question at the start of our conversation, and as to why it's taken time. You've highlighted the complexity. I think it is important around areas that matter for us to get to a level of consensus so we have comparability. And again, the four areas that we've identified with the IBC: people, the planet, prosperity, and principles of governance, and 21 metrics underneath them are a very good starting point. I don't believe that we will, I hope we can, but I don't believe that we will get it perfectly right the first time around. That's why a building block approach is important. But the regulators are certainly going to step up, public policy makers are going to step up, and it is important for all companies, because this is a topic of importance to civil society, to the same employees that they covet as well, irrespective of sector, for customers that they covet. And so it is important for us in a credible way, in a measurable way, to address this issue. And we've experienced it. We've experienced it with COVID. We've experienced it with recent climate events. It is undeniable that climate change is here. It is human caused, that we must, as a global community, step up and address it.
And one thing that I'm personally very interested in is, of course, look, there are going to be some companies who are less enthusiastic about this than you are. And so much of our, reporting and our data collection on this relies on companies reporting things themselves. In this day and age, you have a lot of very interesting third-party providers. You've got companies doing very interesting things with satellite footage, looking at, where does the pipe in this factory come from? Can I, as an external group, tell you their water source? If you have a Bloomberg terminal these days, there's a lot else you can do than looking at just company accounts. How necessary is it nowadays to have companies doing this reporting themselves? And what is the place of a third-party data provider when a company isn't willing to do that hard work?
Well, listen, I think regulators are going to mandate disclosure. And that's why the work with the IFRS Foundation and the work that they're doing is so important. The work that other standard setters in the United States and the European Union are doing is important. And I think there will be a requirement, like there is on financial disclosure, for ESG disclosure. And so I think that is going to be the norm. And there will be multiple stakeholders that will play a part in terms of trying to get accurate reporting out there and holding each of us to account. It is really important that we measure, that we report transparently and honestly, and that we take credible action to address this issue. And as I said, it is absolutely the right thing to do as a global community. It is also the right business thing to do.
Mm. I have to ask, just a few weeks ago, there was this report from the Carbon Tracker Initiative. They'd looked at companies, I think it was over 100 global companies that were in carbon intensive sectors that had their accounting done by big four firms, obviously including Deloitte. And they said, 70% did not indicate whether they'd considered climate when they put together their accounts for last year. they spotted a whole bunch of sort of inconsistencies in things like, pricing of commodities, how, very big companies were not looking at the internationally recognized projections for commodity prices, but, putting on inconsistent numbers of their own. And, I suppose as an accounting firm, I wonder, what's your responsibility in all of this? What was your response to that report? What should you do as an accountant, as well as sort of a company looking after your own employees, when you're doing the accounts for other massive global companies?
Listen, we have a responsibility to uphold the public trust. I said that. We do our darndest. We do a really good job, I believe, in doing that. And as the standards are mandated, are required by regulators and public policymakers, the profession will absolutely adhere to that.
Okay. And one thing I was thinking about is in a lot of this, we think about big global companies. If I think about a lot of groups in emerging markets or smaller firms, is the suggestion that the same standards should apply throughout? Do you think it's feasible, it's practical? It's a genuine question that smaller companies and those outside of the rich world comply with the same accounting standards and metrics?
Well, I think standards need to be consistent, but I think you raise an important point, which is while there will be, as I said, regulatory requirements to report on ESGs eventually, and I think that's a good thing in a very consistent standard way. They need to apply to private companies as well, and they need to apply to non-public companies, and I think that is something that needs to be addressed, needs to be worked on. There has to be consistency so that stranded assets, for instance, can't be moved from the public domain into the private domain. For instance, it's a topic that in many forums we've been discussing, and I think it is important to address it as well.
And the role of private companies themselves. I mean, of course, you guys have put together these frameworks and these ideas of standardization. How involved do they get? In what way do they get involved? I think outsiders portray it as companies just pushing back against having to do more reporting. The burden is really quite huge already on them. And is that really accurate? How do they get involved? And how do they help shape the metrics and the expectations we have of them?
I think we've got to change the conversation, and in fact, the tone and tenor of the conversation as well, from the question that you've asked, and that is, if you can go and demonstrate, like I'm trying to do, and what we've done with Deloitte, that this is in their interest, it actually positively impacts their bottom line, and it does so because key stakeholders that they covet, customers, employees, they're in the same market for customers, whether you're a public or a private company in a particular sector, in the same market for employees, talented employees, and civil society. So it's important to get that narrative out as well, the positive narrative that doing the right thing is not only a good thing to do, it is a good bottom line thing to do. I believe it will lead to more adoption. But the regulatory framework that will come out of the work that is happening now will be the other impetus.
Yeah, I think we have time for sort of one last question. Of course, we've got the COP conference coming up. Global leaders coming together. What will you be watching for? We've had sort of the reporting come out already from the global community, but what will you be watching for at that conference itself in terms of the narrative? What various countries have to say and the real tangible results from it.
Climate change is real. It is here. We must address it. And if we don't, I think it's going to be a challenge that is far greater than what we've navigated with COVID-19. All of us have a role to play, the public sector, the private sector, and we must address this together. And we must step up to this challenge. Otherwise, I don't know how I will answer to my 17-year-old son when he becomes a man, looks back and said, "Why did you not address this challenge?"
That's a very nice place to end there, Puneet. Thank you so much for making the time to speak to us. It's an incredibly interesting subject. Thank you everyone who's joined us. The next session will begin very shortly. Thank you.